Jenke. Now, she is going to speak to us, and Cathy is the only lay speaker at this convention. The only lay speaker. And her theme today is Hope, Seek and You Shall Find. This is very much a personal journey, and it's a personal matter that she's going to talk to you about, her own quest. She's a very experienced broadcaster, having been with Radio Rima for more than 20 years, but in more recent times has dedicated herself to New Zealand's leading Christian program, I might say, which is Focus on the Family, which is very useful. But she's going to tell us about matters that are very close to your and my heart. I'm quite sure of that. These are personal matters. It's her own journey. Ladies and gentlemen, Cathy Jenke.
Gosh, it's great to actually finally meet Philip Sherry after all these years. I used to watch him when I was a child reading the news, and it's like somebody famous. Just got to keep a check on the time here. I've actually never talked for 45 minutes non-stop, although I suspect my family would disagree with that. And it's actually quite daunting seeing the people you talk to, because on radio we don't actually see the people, you just, in a little room. But I came to the Eucharistic Convention for the first time last year with my family, and as I looked around, I wondered if most of the people in the audience had been faithful Catholics all their lives. And I thought about my life and the last 20 years of my life, and how my eyes had been closed to the great treasures and the fullness of the truth in the Catholic faith. God continually seeks us, and he desires that we come to know him and his eternal truths. And I've come to see too, whether we know it or not, that what is within us is also continually seeking God. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my story and how God drew me back to the Catholic faith I knew as a child. I was born pre-Vatican II to Dutch immigrant parents, and I grew up in Nelson. We were a Catholic family. I'm the eldest of 4 children, 2 brothers and a sister. And I also had another brother who was killed in an accident when he was 2 years old. As a child, I always had a deep awareness of God. God permeated everything in my life, my family, my schooling at St. Joseph's Primary in Nelson, and church at St. Mary's. Church was a big part of our lives, and for me, my whole life was centred around God and church. My Catholic faith was very much the focal point of my childhood. I loved going to Mass. I loved the reverence, the incense, benediction, the rosary, fasting that my father encouraged us to do, the Eucharist, and for me as a child, it created a real sense of holiness. And we also used to go to confession on Saturday afternoons, and Saturday evening was family bath night. And I used to go to bed Saturday nights feeling really squeaky clean inside and out. My father was a very devout Catholic, still is, and I used to love watching him pray. And the example that he set, and his love of the church and his love and desire for God, left a huge impact on me. My Catholic education at St. Joseph's Primary School was very much an extension of home and church, and there were a couple of things from my early schooling years that left a deep impression on me. Now, one of them may sound a bit odd. I don't know if anyone here remembers if you went to Catholic primary school. You used to have to write the letters A, M, D, G on top of each page, or a new page of your exercise book, ad majorem de gloriam, to the greater glory of God, on the top of every page. And every time I wrote this, there was something really special about doing that. It was like I was drawn into a sacred space, as I very neatly wrote AMDG. The other thing was that I actually felt really privileged going to a Catholic school. Every day, I would have to walk past the local state primary school in my brown gym frock. The state kids were allowed mufti, the Catholics had to wear uniform, and I knew I stood out, and I knew I was different to these other children. They'd hang over the fence every day and chant as I walked past, "Convent bugs eat slugs every day of the morning." And sometimes I'd actually feel a bit sad. You know, I used to brace myself as I walked past the fence every day, but I also felt sad because I kind of instinctively knew that a lot of these children came from homes that actually had very little to do with God. And I somehow sensed an emptiness there, and I was actually really grateful for what I had. For me, everything connected to God, school, home and church, and there was a sense of every aspect of my life being completely enveloped and wrapped by God. It was all one and the same. It all connected and it made absolute sense. So that was my background in childhood. So with this upbringing, how did I drift away from my Catholic faith? The late teen years and young adulthood is a very vulnerable time in a person's life. It's the time that a lot of exploring happens as the meaning of life and childhood begins to be processed. Scripture talks about loving God with our hearts, souls and minds. And as I look back, I would say for me, the mind bit had a few gaps, and that left me actually quite vulnerable to people who seemed to be more clever and more articulate than I was. I was one of many who left the Catholic Church, either deliberately or just drifted away. What happened with me? When I was 17, I left home in Nelson to go to Canterbury University in Christchurch, and I spent a miserable year there being really homesick. I was still very active in my Catholic faith at that stage, going to Mass, attending prayer meetings, and I was involved with the charismatic renewal. I left university at the end of that year and joined Rema Broadcasting Group, after a very good friend wrote me a letter saying she really felt strongly that God would like me to go to Radio Rema. It's not your average career plan, but that's what I did. And the only skill I had was that I could drive a car. So when I started at Rema, I was the in-house courier driver. But I was always interested in news. I used to love news, and in my spare time between driving jobs, I would hang around the newsroom, and eventually they got sick of me hanging around and offered me a position as a radio journalist, and in those days you learnt on the job. Nowadays you have to get big student loans and a degree. Rema Broadcasting is a non-denominational Christian broadcaster, but I was the only Catholic there. Everyone else was a Protestant, and I think you might see where this is going to go. One day, one of my colleagues at Rema Broadcasting invited me along to a Pentecostal service, and I went along. It sort of didn't really feel like a church service, but I loved the singing, and it was a great sermon. And I went back the next Sunday, and the next, and the next. And that's how I stopped going to Mass, as simple as that. I didn't leave the Catholic Church because I disagreed with anything. I just didn't understand what I'd grown up with, and I just drifted to where there was some great singing. So for the next 20 years, I was an evangelical Pentecostal. Communion was strange at first for me in the Protestant church. Often it was only once a month. It was grape juice and fluffy white bread, and it seemed a bit of an add-on to the service. And if I look back in hindsight, it didn't really seem sacred at all. But what I did love and what I saw was the vitality of Christian living. You go to church on Sunday, get inspired, the great singing, the prayer meetings during the week, and living the good Christian life was very much a part of my life and the lives of the people I knew. But as I look back now, there was always an underlying sense of something sacred was missing. And meanwhile, I met my husband-to-be at Rema, Stuart, and he was a technician there, and we married and had 3 children. And as a family, we went to a small local Pentecostal church, and we had lots of friends there who were also raising their families, so in a sense it was a very happy time for me. Then about 14 years ago, the Rema Broadcasting Group shifted its head offices from Christchurch to Auckland, and my husband was and still is a technician there, so as part of that move we shifted up to Auckland as a family. And shortly after we arrived, I was asked to be producer for the Rema breakfast show, so I went back to broadcasting. I'd been at home raising the children, stay-at-home mum, while the children were young. Now, I hadn't wanted to shift to Auckland. I was very homesick. I didn't know anybody. All my friends and family were in Christchurch, and I was really unhappy. And that's often the times that we're quite open to God. One of the first things we did when we arrived in Auckland was to look for a good church to settle into. And I wasn't really happy with any of the ones we went along to. One week we'd go to a Baptist, the next week an independent, the week after something else, but I just wasn't happy. I just couldn't face going to church pretending to be a sort of happy, got-it-together Christian. And then I can't actually remember how we found out about this, but we heard just down the road from where we lived, there was a 6 p.m. vigil mass on a Saturday evening in a tiny little Catholic church just by where we lived. And I thought to myself, mass is only an hour long. I'm used to sort of 2-hour services. All Sunday would be free, and I didn't have to pretend anything. So I said to my husband that I'd like us to go along to Mass that night. You know who's the bossy one. He looked a bit worried, but because we'd been to Mass on occasion at Christmas and Easter with my parents in Christchurch, it wasn't so daunting for him. The Mass was an absolute contrast to the services I was used to. It was very quiet. But as I sat there, I was overwhelmed with an unexpected and incredible sense of homecoming, and I kept wanting to cry. I kept looking at the ceiling, furiously blinking, as you do, hoping nobody would notice your tears. We didn't go back to that little church for the next 4 years. We went to a big Pentecostal church, but in going to Mass that evening, God had somehow given me the strength to cope with the upheaval that I was feeling. The next stage of my homecoming back to the Catholic Church happened on a couple of fronts. One was through my colleagues at Rema Broadcasting, and the other was through my children's schooling. Never underestimate the smallest thing you do. You never know the flow-on effects. It was time we were considering secondary schooling for our children. We were looking around for a good secondary school. It's something we were a bit anxious about. Our children were going to the local state primary school, and somebody put a notice in the school notices about an open night information evening at St Dominic's Catholic College in West Auckland. Now, to this day, I don't know who put that notice in, but it sent off a whole chain of events that saw me come back to my Catholic faith, my children baptised and confirmed into the Catholic faith, my husband, who comes from generations of Protestants, received into the church 3 years ago, and also 3 other family members come back to their Catholic faith. I'll tell you about those shortly. I never even thought or had thought about Catholic education for our children, but when I saw that notice in the school notices, I knew I was on to something. Well, actually, I think God did, but we went to the open night, and I can remember it clearly even now as we were walking up the driveway, the school driveway. Again, I had this incredible sense of homecoming. My daughter was accepted at St Dominic's, and I'd begun again to be aware of Catholic things. I remember one day my daughter came home from school saying they had to recite the Our Father, but she didn't know it. Now, I was horrified that she didn't know it. The Our Father, she doesn't know the Our Father, the great prayer that Jesus Christ taught us. I used to love praying the Our Father at Mass when I was a child, and my daughter didn't know it. Now, the church circles we were in encouraged what is known, or what we call memory verses, where you memorise pieces of scripture. And as parents, we were pretty slack on that, so I didn't really blame my daughter that she didn't know the Our Father. But that day that she came home saying she didn't know the Our Father, it was like a light went on in my head. It wasn't just a memory verse that had been neglected, it was the handing on and passing down of the great prayer of Christ that had been prayed for 2,000 years. And it wasn't just the prayer that had been neglected. I realised I wanted our children to know not only the Our Father, but I wanted them to know what I'd loved in my childhood. And even though I didn't understand what was happening myself, I somehow knew I wanted our children to be baptised and confirmed into the Catholic faith. So, as part of the process, they joined RCIA, Rite of Initiation for Adults program. They're quite young, but it was just the way it worked out. And then as a family, we started sneaking along to Mass, but it was very difficult for my husband and I in particular. We had real reservations and mixed feelings and lots of questions. And the fact that we were going to Mass, we kept it pretty quiet from our friends and colleagues. Our 3 children were baptised Easter 2000, rather appropriate year, I think. And I remember the Easter Vigil Mass. It was beautiful. I was blown away by what I thought was the really cool big fire outside in the darkened church, and it was all very atmospheric. But at the same time, I felt really afraid. And I was afraid about the things I didn't understand. I was afraid that our family could fragment on the spiritual front, because while Catholicism was familiar to me, it wasn't for my husband. But I'm deeply, deeply grateful and thankful that Stuart was very gracious and went along with my desire for our children to be baptised, but I knew he was really concerned. We both still had lots of big questions, and I fluctuated between thinking and worrying about these questions and then being a bit of an ostrich and put my head in the sand and pretending everything was okay. Now, the questions that always come up generally are Mary, Catholics don't worship Mary, that's idolatry, praying to the saints, there's only one mediator, so why pray to dead people? The Eucharist, why does Christ have to keep re-sacrificing himself? Purgatory, if you're a Christian, you go straight to heaven. Christ represents you like a lawyer, so to speak. Things like scripture and tradition, faith and works, confession, sacraments, priesthood, why do you need a priest when you've got Jesus? Venial and mortal sin. All of these questions were going through my mind. It was how I understood things at the time. And it's the most frightening thing to have your whole belief system challenged. You feel like your salvation is at stake. You feel like you're going to the dark side. And how do you know who is right? I didn't know the answers to these questions. And to be honest, at first I didn't even know the questions. I kind of grew into understanding what I didn't understand, if you know what I mean. But you can only be an ostrich so long with your head in the sand, because someone comes along and plucks some feathers. And the next phase of my journey back to the Catholic Church happened when our daughter joined the music group at St Patrick's Cathedral, and it became obvious to one of the members in the group that our daughter actually didn't know that much about her faith. And one day, this person gave our daughter a book to read. It was called Catholic and Christian. I think it's by Dr. Alan Schreck, if I remember rightly. And it's a book that looks at Protestant and Catholic beliefs. It compares and contrasts them, looks at where there's misunderstandings and confusion. This person warned my daughter it was quite a simple book, but it might help explain some things. When she came home, I pounced on it and started reading it, and I really liked the tone of it because it wasn't anti-anything, and it did acknowledge what was common between the two groups. It explained some things, but it also actually ended up whetting my appetite and raising more questions than it answered. And I wasn't quite sure sort of what to do or how to go about this and where to from here. So I thought to myself, I've got all these questions. and actually I'm not quite sure where to find the answers. I love reading, so a library full of Catholic books would be the perfect answer, and I wondered if there was such a place, because reading would allow me space and time to think and mull. At the same time, I also felt really fragile and vulnerable about my lack of understanding, and I was a bit shy approaching the priests at the cathedral. And then I had this really bright idea. I thought, well, I'll ring the bishop's office. He might know where there's a Catholic library. So I rang the office and asked if there was anywhere I could get hold of some books to read. I was directed to the libraries at CIT and Good Shepherd College, and I rang both libraries, but to be honest, I've always been a bit daunted by librarians. They seem to know way too much. But God knows the searching heart. A few weeks later, at work at Rema Broadcasting, one of the news websites that came across my desk had a story, and I can't remember what the story was about, but it just happened to mention, in passing, about a former Protestant minister who was now a Catholic. And I got really excited. I wanted to find out more. So in between announcing and dealing with talkback calls, I was desperately doing a Google search on the internet on this person. And I was really excited. A Protestant that had become a Catholic, maybe this person would have some of the answers I needed. So I typed in the name Scott Hahn. Now I know many of you here will know that name, but for those that don't, Dr. Scott Hahn was a former Protestant minister who became a Catholic. He was also highly educated, and I knew he wouldn't have converted lightly or easily. So I thought, perfect. On the internet, I found a brief testimony and conversion story of this guy, and I felt like I'd won lotto. I printed it off and took it home to show my husband. He didn't say too much, but I knew he was intrigued, and suddenly both of us didn't feel quite so alone. The next day I did, because we don't have internet at home, back at work I did some more internet searching on the Scott Hahn guy and found that there was a whole website with Catholic teaching on covenants, salvation, sacraments, everything you can think of, and I was beside myself with excitement. I felt like I'd struck a gold mine, and I printed all the stuff off and took it home to tell the family about it. Now I was really excited, but I think my children thought I'd visited Mars that day. I mean, most mums come home, you know, with some nice stuff, chips, fizzy drinks. I came home with a convert story, and I don't think they were that impressed. In fact, one of my sons, I've got a wee story about him shortly, he was in his religious education class at school learning all about cults, and he was convinced I was joining a cult because I was so excited. So I'd come home from work day after day just buzzing and so excited about my new discoveries about the Catholic faith that I found on the internet. It was like suddenly a whole world had opened up. The next phase of understanding of the Catholic faith for me was to begin. I knew I wasn't alone anymore, and some questions had been answered, but I still had a lot more to understand. I needed to understand the answers at a deeper level. And that's where my work colleagues at Rema Broadcasting came in. I knew they would challenge me. They loved a good apologetics discussion, and I'm really hopeless at that sort of thing. Working in an all-Protestant environment, you are bound at some stage to be asked where you go to church. The church you go to defines your identity. And I used to avoid that question like the plague because I knew I would be challenged and I just wasn't ready for it. But one day the inevitable happened and I was asked where I went to church, and I mumbled St. Patrick's. What's St. Patrick's? Was the response. It's in town, knowing I didn't answer the question. Yeah, but what church is that one? It's a mass. What's a mass? I tell you, St. Peter doesn't look so bad. Catholic Church. And so it began. A Catholic church? Don't they worship Mary, believe in purgatory? I thought, here we go. No, they don't actually worship Mary, and I was really ready, well, so I thought, to trial my newfound understanding on Mary, but I was shot down to pieces. my colleagues could run rings around me, so instead I'd just listen to them. I'm a bit stubborn sometimes, and I thought to myself, no, I'm sure there is more to this. I recognised that my colleagues had actually asked some really valid questions, so back to the internet for more answers and more understanding. And the more this happened, the more I was challenged, the more I searched, and the more I began to understand the fullness of Catholic truth. I was so hungry to know and understand. And I say this with all sincerity, I am incredibly grateful to my work colleagues for all their challenges. Instead of dreading these exchanges, I actually began to enjoy them. I would think, yep, it's a really good question, I don't know how to answer it, I don't know the answer, and I'd go and try and find it and discover something else. Over time too, my approach to reading and searching began to change. Initially it was very much, I'm referring to Catholic teaching here, you prove yourself to me, what's right and why it's right. But over time, that attitude began to change to, actually, I'm presuming this is right, but I don't yet understand it. I just need time. And that was a significant shift because my baseline was, there is truth here, but I don't yet understand it. I began to understand more about things like the communion of saints, Mary, purgatory, the sacraments, salvation history, the Mass, and I just loved it. And over time, I began to realise the Catholic Church has an incredible treasure. I felt like I'd discovered this big treasure chest and I could just keep digging and digging. I loved the depth of thinking and the completeness of truth. And my colleagues have no idea how much their questions and challenges contributed to my growing belief and understanding of my Catholic faith. One of the last bastions of doubt and fear for me was the Rosary. I just couldn't bring myself to pray the Rosary. I knew I wanted to understand it, not just here, but in my heart. And God knows. Early last year, just before Easter, I rediscovered the Rosary that I used to pray as a child. I'd been praying for one of my sons. I wanted my son to know and own his own faith for himself, not just tag along with the family. Of course, none of my manipulations and sermonisings had worked. I'm sure those with teenagers know about that. And then one day, out of desperation, I thought to myself, well, I'm really desperate here. The only thing I haven't tried is praying the Rosary. A few months earlier, I'd secretly bought some rosary beads, but I could never bring myself to pray them, or pray the Rosary, use the beads. I'd just carry them in my handbag and occasionally get them out and hold them and sort of fiddle with them. But the step to pray was too big. So I was desperate here. So I got the beads out and started to pray the Hail Mary. Now, it was a really strange feeling. I was a bit frightened. And the other thing was I had to keep looking at the instruction booklet on the Rosary because I'd forgotten how to pray it. And it's actually quite hard following the instruction booklet and trying to enter into the spirit of the occasion at the same time. Anyway, for 2 or 3 weeks, I would come home from work and kneel beside my bed and pray the Rosary, and I'd cry. And I wasn't sure if the tears were about me discovering the Rosary or if the tears were for my son. And I did actually too feel slightly sheepish, and I was quite glad no one was around. And then one day, a couple of weeks after dinner, my son said to me, now I actually texted him, he's in Australia at the moment, for permission to tell the story, and he said yes, but he wants copyright fees. I told him I gave birth to him. So he's okay that I can tell this story. So my son, after tea, this was just before Easter last year, said, "Mum, thanks for tea, I'm off now." I said, "Oh, where are you off to?" "The movies," because he'd talked about that earlier in the day. He said, "No, confession." And that was around the rite of reconciliation too, I think, time. Now, my son could have knocked me over with a feather. Okay, I said in my very best casual, non-interfering voice, see you later. And then as soon as he'd gone, I just sat on the couch absolutely stunned for a couple of hours that this teenager of mine would voluntarily choose to seek out confession. And to be honest, I did wonder what sins he'd committed. My son came home after confession and was beside himself with excitement. I had gone to bed. I pretended to be asleep, but my ears were sort of tuned out. And he came into the room and just whacked me on my legs on the bed and said, "Mum, it was awesome." And God just hit him with a big bang. He was so blown away by what happened at confession, and when the priest put his hands on him, just God met him there. And he loved it, and he went again 2 weeks later, and I thought, gosh, what's he done in between? And then what was even more amazing, I saw him put some of his own money into the offering next time he was at Mass. I had envisaged this son of mine would experience some sort of grand trumpet fanfare revelation of God. I would never have guessed it had been through confession. Of all the ways that God could reveal himself to my son, he chose to do it through confession. And I'd never have picked him as a confessional junkie. He loves going to it. And I'm still actually slightly flabbergasted at this, and I remind myself never to presume the ways of God. And that particular night last Easter, when he came home from confession, I suddenly remembered the rosary that I'd been praying. And I thought, oh my goodness. So I'm okay now with praying the rosary. Meanwhile, while all this was happening for me, my husband Stuart had his own journey into the Catholic Church. One day there were some church notices at St Patrick's Cathedral, and there was mention of a meeting that was going to explain the Catholic faith. Now, Stuart was still graciously coming along to Mass for the sake of the family and thought he'd go along to find out a bit more. Well, that was really it for him. I think we both did, sort of misunderstood the notices, and it was actually a Rite of Reconciliation program, RCIA. And he began to go along week after week. Now, I actually stayed right out of this because I was worried of any accusations of manipulation, so I just lay really low. And he had his own journey, and then 3 years ago, in 2005, Stuart was received into the Catholic Church. And he came with a certain amount of fear and anxiety, but decided to go through with his decision anyway. Along his journey, he met a couple of people who'd been received into the church, and one of the most helpful pieces of advice they gave him was that you don't need to throw anything away of what you believe. Just continue down the path, and you may find that some things you hold to actually no longer matter. And as time has gone by, my husband and I are discovering more and more about our Catholic faith, and we are really, truly grateful for what we've found, and we continually learn and discover new things. Last year, our daughter attended the Catholic Discipleship College here in Takapuna last year, and we learned through her a whole heap more about the sacraments, things like morning and evening prayer, the writings of the saints, the Angelus, church teachings, faith, morality, all those sort of things. And also, and I say this with a bit of trepidation, but actually the Catholic Church too has a great treasure and teaching on suffering. Last November, my mother unexpectedly died, and during my mother's final week, our daughter, with all her newfound understanding on her Catholic faith, led us in morning and evening prayer and rosary, and she'd also have lots of discussions with extended family members about Catholicism. And I didn't realise at the time, but the Catholic ritual around my mother's deathbed deeply impacted my family. Shortly after my mother's death, my nephew, who'd been baptised as a child in the Catholic Church and then spent the next 25 years doing his own thing, took First Communion 3 months ago. Another nephew is considering Catholicism. Sunday night 3 weeks ago, the phone rang, and it was one of my brothers calling me. He was really excited, and he rang to say that he and his wife, after 25 years, are going back to Mass. He said that, among other things, they'd been deeply touched by the Catholic ritual, so he said, around the time of my mother's dying. And last week, my sister told me that after 20-something years in the Protestant church, she's just started going back to Mass. And while she's got lots of questions like I did, she's seeking out answers, and I keep sending her books. I'm continually amazed at how God works, and I'm slowly learning never to presume anything, and I'm learning more and more to trust God. He loves us and our loved ones far more than we ever could, and he's continually seeking us out. I'd just like to finish with this scripture, which sums up for me, I guess, my journey back to Catholicism, and I also think it sums up how God reveals himself to us. And it's in Ezekiel chapter 47, verses 3 to 5, and here it goes. He led me outside by the north gate and around to the outer gate facing the east, where I saw water trickling from the southern side. Then, when he had walked off to the east with a measuring cord in his hand, he measured off 1,000 cubits and had me wade through the water, which was ankle deep. He measured off another 1,000 and once more had me wade through the water, which was now knee deep. And again he measured off 1,000 and had me wade, and the water was now waist deep. Once more he measured off 1,000, but there was now a river through which I could not wade. For the water had risen so high, it had become a river that could not be crossed except by swimming, a river that could not be passed through. Thank you, everyone. God bless.